The saloon doors swung open with such force that every head in Maginty's turned to watch the woman stride in like she owned the place, her dusty boots clicking against the wooden floor with purpose that made the piano player miss a note. Katherine "Kit" Dawson had ridden 3 days straight from Kansas City to reach Galesburg, Illinois, in this sweltering July of 1882. And she had not come to admire the scenery or sample the whiskey. She had come for what was rightfully hers. The letter folded in her vest pocket had changed everything. Her uncle, a man she barely remembered from childhood visits before the war, had passed away 6 months prior, leaving behind a cattle ranch just outside of town. The lawyer's correspondence had been brief and businesslike, informing her that she was the sole heir to the property known as the Double Creek Ranch. What the letter had failed to mention was that the current occupant, one Jacob Zachariah, had been operating the ranch for the past 8 years under an informal agreement with her uncle, and seemed to believe he had some claim to continue doing so. Kit approached the bar, her copper-red hair pulled back in a braid that fell halfway down her back, her green eyes scanning the room with the kind of assessment that came from years of reading people in her father's trading post. The bartender, a heavy-set man with impressive mutton chops, wiped down the counter and regarded her with undisguised curiosity. "Looking for Jacob Zachariah," she announced, her voice carrying across the sudden quiet. "I was told he takes his afternoon drink here." A low chuckle rippled through the assembled cowboys and townsfolk. The bartender nodded toward a table in the back corner where a man sat alone, a half-empty glass of whiskey before him, a wide-brimmed hat tipped back to reveal sun-bronzed features and dark hair that needed a trim. He was looking directly at her, his expression unreadable. Kit crossed the distance between them with measured steps, aware of every eye following her progress. She had dressed practically for travel, wearing split riding skirts and a simple white blouse beneath a leather vest, but she knew her presence as an unescorted woman in a saloon was causing a stir. She did not care. "Jacob Zachariah?" she asked when she reached his table. "Depends on who is asking," he replied, his voice a low rumble that held traces of Texas in the vowels. He stood, and Kit found herself looking up at a man who topped 6 feet easily, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of men who worked hard for their living. His eyes were a startling blue-gray, like storm clouds over the prairie, and they studied her with equal parts wariness and interest. "Katherine Dawson, I believe you have been living on my property." Something flickered across his face, resignation maybe, or recognition. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "I wondered when you would show up. The lawyer said he had sent word." 6 weeks ago," Kit confirmed, sitting down and placing her hands flat on the scarred wooden table. "I expected to arrive and take possession of my inheritance. Instead, I am told by half the town that you are running the Double Creek like it belongs to you." Jacob settled back into his chair, rolling the whiskey glass between his palms. Up close, she could see the lines that sun and work had carved around his eyes, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the calluses on his long fingers. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 at most, and there was a weariness to him that spoke of burdens carried. "Your uncle and I had an arrangement," he said carefully. "I had been working as a hand on a spread further west, saved up enough to buy my own place. Found the Double Creek when your uncle was getting too old to manage it alone. We agreed I would work the ranch, improve the herds, maintain the property. In exchange, I would have first right to purchase when he was ready to sell. But he did not sell," Kit pointed out. "He died, and he left the ranch to me." "He did," Jacob acknowledged, "and I am not contesting the will." "The ranch is legally yours, Miss Dawson. I am not disputing that fact. His easy agreement surprised her. She had prepared for an argument, possibly even legal complications. "Then you will vacate the property. Where would you like me to go?" he asked, and there was no bitterness in the question, only genuine curiosity. "I have put 8 years of my life into that land, built up the herd from 60 head to over 300, repaired every fence, replaced half the roof on the main house, dug a new well when the old one went brackish. I am not saying that earns me ownership, Miss Dawson, but I am saying I have nowhere else to go and nothing but the clothes on my back and the horse tied outside if I leave." Kit felt a pang of something uncomfortable in her chest. She had not expected to feel sympathy for the man standing between her and her inheritance. "That is hardly my problem, Mr. Zachariah. No, I suppose it is not." He drained the rest of his whiskey and set the glass down with a soft thunk. "But I do have a proposition for you. I am listening." "You are new to ranching, I assume. Your uncle mentioned you grew up helping your father run a trading post in Kansas City. That is fine work, but it is not the same as managing cattle, dealing with drought, fending off rustlers, breaking horses, handling calving season." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "The Double Creek is a good ranch, Miss Dawson, but it requires someone who knows what they are doing. Fire me, send me packing, and you will be starting from scratch with hired hands who may or may not have your best interests at heart. And your solution is, let me stay on as foreman. I will work for wages, same as any other hand. You own the ranch, you make the decisions, you take the profits. But I run the day-to-day operations, teach you what you need to know, and we both benefit." Kit studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Why would you agree to work for wages on land you clearly believe should be yours?" "Because it is better than riding away with nothing," he said bluntly. "And because your uncle was a good man who treated me fairly. I owe him the courtesy of making sure his niece does not lose everything he built through simple inexperience." The offer was logical, Kit had to admit. She knew nothing about ranching beyond what she had read in agricultural journals on the train west. But the thought of being beholden to this stranger, of having him question every decision she made, rankled her independent nature. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Fair enough." Jacob pushed back from the table and stood. "I am heading back to the ranch now. You can ride out tomorrow, take a look at the property, see what you are inheriting. Then decide if you want me to stay or go. How will I find it? Anyone in town can give you directions. It is about an hour's ride north. Follow the creek until you see the cottonwood grove." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more automatic courtesy than conscious choice. "Welcome to Galesburg, Miss Dawson." She watched him walk out, tracking his progress to the door, and then beyond through the saloon's front window as he mounted a big bay gelding and rode off at an easy lope. The bartender materialized at her elbow with a glass of water she had not requested. "Jake is a good man," he offered without preamble. "Honest as the day is long. Your uncle trusted him completely." "Everyone seems quite invested in singing his praises," Kit observed. "That is because he has earned them. Helped out half the ranchers in the county when that hard winter hit in '80. Worked for free rebuilding the church after the fire. He is not a man who is going to cheat you or cause trouble." Kit thanked him for the water and the information, though she filed both away with appropriate skepticism. She had learned long ago that small towns often had their own politics and alliances that outsiders could not immediately perceive. For all she knew, Jacob Zachariah had everyone convinced of his sainthood while planning to somehow wrest the ranch away from her through some legal trickery. She spent the remainder of the afternoon arranging for a room at the town's modest hotel and purchasing supplies for the next day's ride. Galesburg was a growing community, benefiting from its position along the railroad line and the fertile farmland that surrounded it. The streets bustled with activity, farmers bringing in produce, merchants hawking their wares, children racing barefoot through the dust. It was not Kansas City, but it had a vitality that Kit found appealing. That night, she lay awake in the hotel bed, listening to the sounds of the town settling down for sleep and thinking about the ranch she had inherited sight unseen. Her uncle had been her mother's older brother, a man who had headed west before Kit was born and built a life she knew very little about. The few times he had visited, she had been too young to form clear memories, retaining only impressions of a tall man with a booming laugh and rough hands that were gentle when he ruffled her hair. Her mother had died when Kit was 14, a fever that came on sudden and took her within 3 days. Her father had never recovered from the loss, retreating into his work and drink, leaving Kit to manage the trading post and raise herself. When he died 2 years later, Kit had sold the business and struck out on her own, working as a bookkeeper and occasional schoolteacher, scraping together a modest savings and dreaming of a future where she answered to no one. The ranch was that future. Her own land, her own home, her own life built exactly as she wanted it. She would not let anyone, no matter how helpful they claimed to be, take that away from her. Morning came with clear skies and temperatures that promised to climb into the 90s by midday. Kit dressed in her riding clothes, braided her hair, and made her way to the livery stable where she had boarded her horse the previous day. The stable owner, an elderly man named Cyrus who had approximately 3 teeth remaining in his head, helped her saddle her mare and provided detailed directions to the Double Creek. "Fine piece of land," he told her as she mounted up. "Your uncle knew what he was doing when he claimed it. Good water, decent grazing, close enough to town for convenience but far enough out for privacy." Kit thanked him and set off, following the main road north until it intersected with the creek he had mentioned. The landscape was beautiful in the way of prairie country, rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers and stands of oak and hickory. The creek itself ran clear and steady, lined with willows and cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. She passed 2 other ranches on her route, noting the quality of the fencing and the condition of the cattle she could see grazing in the distance. The Double Creek announced itself with a carved wooden sign hanging from a post, the letters weathered but still legible. Kit turned down the drive, her heart beginning to beat faster with anticipation. The main house came into view first, a solid 2-story structure built from local timber with a wide front porch and real glass windows. Beyond it, she could see the barn, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, and a series of corrals. Jacob emerged from the barn as she approached, wiping his hands on a rag and squinting up at her against the sun. He wore the same clothes as yesterday, or perhaps identical ones, and his hat sat at an angle that suggested he had pushed it back in the middle of work and forgotten about it. "You found it," he said unnecessarily. "Your directions were accurate." Kit dismounted and looped her reins over the porch rail. "May I look around? It is your property," he reminded her. "You do not need my permission." But he fell into step beside her anyway as she toured the grounds, pointing out features and explaining improvements. The barn was well maintained, the stalls clean and the tack organized with military precision. The bunkhouse was currently empty, he explained, because he had let the 2 seasonal hands go at the end of spring roundup and had been managing the ranch alone since. "That seems like a lot of work for one person," Kit observed. "It is," he agreed, "but I did not see the point in keeping men on when I did not know if I would still be here come fall." The main house was the real revelation. Kit had expected rough bachelor quarters, perhaps a single room with a cot and a stove. Instead, she found a proper home, simply furnished but clean and comfortable. The ground floor held a parlor, a dining area, and a kitchen with a cast-iron stove and a hand pump for water. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, one clearly in use, and the others holding only bare bed frames and dusty floors. "Your uncle lived here until about 5 years ago," Jacob explained, standing in the doorway while Kit explored. "Then his rheumatism got bad enough that he moved to a room in town, closer to the doctor. He told me to use the house rather than let it sit empty." "Which room was his?" Kit asked. Jacob pointed to the largest bedroom, the one at the front of the house with windows overlooking the approach. "That one. I have been using the smallest room out of respect. I can clear out my things today if you want to move in." Kit walked to the window and looked out over the ranch, her ranch, spread before her in the late morning light. 300 head of cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. The creek curved through the property like a silver ribbon, the cottonwood grove marking the western boundary. It was more than she had imagined, better than she had hoped. And Jacob Zachariah clearly knew every inch of it, had literally built parts of it with his own 2 hands. "I need someone I can trust," she said without turning around. "How do I know you are that person?" "You do not," he answered honestly. "Trust is earned, not given. But I can tell you this, Miss Dawson. I have spent 8 years building something here. I am not going to sabotage it now just because the ownership changed. This ranch matters to me. If you keep me on, it will get the same care and attention it has always gotten. If you let me go, you will need to find someone else who cares half as much, and that will not be easy." Kit turned to face him. "What are standard wages for a foreman? $40 a month plus room and board." "I will pay you $50, but I want a full accounting of all ranch finances, and I want to be involved in every major decision. You do not sell cattle, hire hands, or make significant purchases without my approval." Something that might have been relief crossed his face. "Those terms are acceptable. And if I find out you have been dishonest with me, even once, you are gone immediately. No second chances. Understood?" He extended his hand across the space between them. "Do we have an agreement, Miss Dawson?" Kit crossed the room and took his hand, feeling the rough calluses against her palm, the firm grip that neither crushed nor condescended. "We have an agreement, Mr. Zachariah. I will move into the house tomorrow. Tonight I need to settle my affairs in town and arrange for my belongings to be brought out. I will move my things to the bunkhouse this afternoon," he said. "The house is yours." Over the next several weeks, Kit threw herself into learning everything she could about running a ranch. Jacob proved to be a patient if taciturn teacher, showing her how to read cattle brands, assess the health of livestock, calculate feed costs, and navigate the complex social dynamics of the local ranching community. He took her on long rides across the property, pointing out the best grazing areas, the spots where the creek tended to flood during heavy rains, the line of fence that would need replacing before winter. Kit discovered that ranching involved far more bookkeeping than she had anticipated, which suited her skills perfectly. She took over the financial records, organizing them with a systematic approach that made Jacob shake his head in bemused admiration. She found discrepancies in the accounts from previous years, not through any dishonesty, but simply through disorganized record keeping, and set about correcting them. "Your uncle was better with cattle than with numbers," Jacob admitted when she pointed out that he had underpaid taxes 2 years running through simple mathematical errors. "And I am not much better, truth be told. This is more organized than the books have been in years." They fell into a routine. Jacob rose before dawn to check on the herd and handle the early morning chores. Kit woke an hour later, prepared breakfast for both of them, and spent the morning on correspondence, bookkeeping, and studying the agricultural texts she had ordered from Chicago. Afternoons were spent working together, whether mending fence, treating sick cattle, or breaking horses. Evenings, they ate dinner together at the kitchen table, discussing the next day's tasks and the long-term plans for the ranch. It was during one of these dinners, about 6 weeks after Kit had moved to the ranch, that Jacob asked her the question she had been dreading. "Why did you come out here?" He gestured with his fork at the house around them. "You could have sold the place, taken the money, and lived comfortably in some city back east. Why choose this life?" Kit considered her answer carefully. They had maintained a professional courtesy with each other, friendly but not friends, employer and employee with clearly defined boundaries. But something about the golden evening light and the exhaustion that came from a long day's physical labor loosened her usual reserve. "My father spent his whole life building something for someone else," she said slowly. "He worked in my grandfather's business. Then when my grandfather died, my uncle inherited everything and my father got nothing. He had to start over from scratch, and he never forgot that bitterness. I think it killed him in the end as much as the drink did." She paused, pushing potatoes around her plate. "I did not want that life. I did not want to work for someone else's profit to build something I could never own. When I got the lawyer's letter about the ranch, it felt like fate. A chance to have something that was truly mine that no one could take away." Jacob nodded slowly. "I understand that feeling. Do you? You agreed to work for wages rather than ownership. Because half a loaf is better than none," he said. "I grew up the youngest of 7 children on a dirt farm in Texas. There was never going to be land for me there. My father's property would go to my oldest brother, as was proper, and the rest of us would have to make our own way. I worked cattle drives for 5 years, saved every penny, and came north looking for opportunity. Your uncle gave me that. Maybe not in the way I had originally hoped, but working here, building something even if my name is not on the deed, that is still better than drifting from ranch to ranch with nothing to show for my years." It was the most personal thing he had shared since Kit arrived, and she felt an unexpected kinship with this quiet man who understood the need to build something permanent in a transient world. "I am glad you stayed," she said impulsively. "I could not do this without you." He met her eyes across the table, and something in his expression made her heart skip unexpectedly. "You would have figured it out. You are smarter than you give yourself credit for." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Kit did not want to examine too closely. Then Jacob stood, clearing his plate, and the spell broke. "Early start tomorrow," he said. "The Johnsons are bringing their bull over for breeding with our heifers." "I remember," Kit assured him. "I have it in the schedule." She listened to him walk across the yard to the bunkhouse, his footsteps fading into the night sounds of the prairie. Then she sat alone in the kitchen, her dinner growing cold, and wondered why the house suddenly felt too large and too empty. The arrival of autumn brought new challenges and new routines. The weather turned cooler, a relief after the oppressive heat of summer, and the work shifted to preparing for winter. Jacob hired 2 temporary hands to help with the fall roundup, older cowboys named Pete and Samuel, who treated Kit with wary respect and took their orders from Jacob without complaint. Kit rode out with them during the roundup, determined to understand every aspect of the ranch's operation. It was brutal work, long days in the saddle pushing cattle from the far pastures back to the home corrals, separating out the steers that would be sold at market from the breeding stock that would be kept over winter. She learned to rope, though her attempts were clumsy compared to the easy expertise of the men around her. She learned to think like a cow, to anticipate where the herd would try to break away, to position her horse to turn back stragglers. And she learned to see Jacob Zachariah as something other than an employee. It was impossible not to admire his skill, the way he seemed to communicate with his horse through imperceptible cues, the smooth efficiency of his movements whether roping a calf or reinforcing a broken section of fence. But it was the smaller moments that caught her attention. The way he always poured her coffee first in the mornings before serving himself. How he had quietly repaired the broken step on the front porch without being asked, because he noticed she had stumbled over it. The time she found him in the barn, painstakingly cleaning and oiling all her tack, because he said it would last longer with proper care. He was kind, she realized. Genuinely kind in a way that had nothing to do with expecting reward or recognition. He was kind to the horses, to the cattle, to old Pete, whose rheumatism sometimes made mounting difficult. And he was kind to her, patient with her questions, encouraging when she made mistakes, quietly pleased when she succeeded. Kit had known handsome men, charming men, educated men who could quote poetry and discuss philosophy. But she had never known someone who made her feel simultaneously challenged and protected, respected and cherished. It was a confusing combination of emotions, and she tried to ignore them, to maintain the professional distance that had served them well for months. That distance shattered on a cold October morning when everything went wrong at once. They had been moving a group of cattle to fresh pasture when one of the cows, a ornery old girl named Bess, decided to make a break for freedom. She bolted from the herd, crashing through a weak section of fence and heading straight for the creek at full speed. Kit, riding closest, spurred her mare after her without thinking, focused only on turning the cow before she reached the water and potentially injured herself. What Kit did not see, because her attention was fixed on the fleeing cow, was the washout hidden in the tall grass. Her mare stepped into it at full gallop, stumbled, and went down hard. Kit felt herself flying through the air, had a moment of crystalline terror, and then impacted the ground with force that knocked every bit of air from her lungs. She lay gasping, unable to breathe, panic rising as her body refused to obey her commands. Then Jacob was there, kneeling beside her, his face pale beneath his tan. "Do not try to talk," he said, his voice urgent but steady. "You got the wind knocked out. Just try to relax, your breathing will come back." His hand rested on her shoulder, warm and solid, and Kit focused on that touch, on his presence, as her lungs finally remembered how to function. Air rushed back in a painful gasp, and she coughed, tears streaming from her eyes. "Easy," Jacob murmured. "Easy now, just breathe, that is it." When she could finally speak, the first thing she said was, "My horse. She is fine, on her feet and looking embarrassed. You took the worst of it." His hands moved carefully, professionally, checking her limbs for injury. "Can you move your fingers? Your toes?" Kit wiggled both, relieved when everything responded. "I think I am all right, just bruised." "You are sure? Nothing feels broken, I am sure." She started to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through her ribs. "Mostly sure." "That is it, we are getting you to the doctor." Jacob's tone brooked no argument. He turned toward where Pete and Samuel had caught up, holding the reins of his horse. "Pete, you and Samuel finish moving the herd. I am taking Miss Dawson to town." "I am fine," Kit protested. "It is just bruising." "And if it is more than bruising, you will do permanent damage by ignoring it." He helped her to her feet with gentle hands, steadying her when she swayed. "Can you ride? Or should I take you in the wagon?" pried Ward with pragmatism. Kit looked at her patient mare, and then at the distance back to the ranch house where the wagon was stored. "I can ride." He boosted her into the saddle with more care than necessary, then mounted his own horse and positioned himself close beside her for the ride to town. Kit was grateful for his presence, because by the time they reached Galesburg, her ribs were screaming with every breath, and her head had begun to pound in time with her heartbeat. The doctor, a cheerful middle-aged woman named Dr. Ellen Shaw, examined Kit thoroughly and pronounced her extremely lucky. No broken bones, no concussion, just severe bruising that would hurt like blazes for the next few weeks and require rest to heal properly. No riding, no lifting, no chores, Dr. Shaw instructed firmly. I want you to spend the next week doing absolutely nothing but resting. After that, light activity only for another week. I have a ranch to run, Kit objected, and you have a foreman to help you do it, the doctor countered. She glanced at Jacob, who had refused to leave the examination room despite propriety. Mr. Zachariah, I am holding you personally responsible for making sure she follows my orders. Yes, madam, Jacob said solemnly. The ride back to the ranch was slow and painful. By the time they arrived, Kit was exhausted and hurting badly enough that she did not protest when Jacob helped her down from her horse and practically carried her into the house. He settled her on the parlor sofa with unexpected gentleness, then disappeared into the kitchen. She heard the clank of the stove being stoked, the pump working, and some quiet cursing that made her smile despite the pain. He returned with a cup of willow bark tea, which tasted terrible but would help with the pain, and strict instructions to rest. Then he vanished again, and Kit drifted in a haze of exhaustion and discomfort, listening to the sounds of him moving around the house. When she woke, evening light slanted through the windows and the smell of cooking filled the air. Kit sat up carefully, finding that while everything still hurt, it was a duller ache than before. She made her way to the kitchen and found Jacob at the stove, stirring something in a pot with intense concentration. "You should be resting," he said without turning around. "I was." "How did you know I was awake?" I heard the floor creak. He ladled stew into 2 bowls and carried them to the table. "It is nothing fancy, just what I could manage, but it is hot and it is food." They ate in silence for a few minutes before Kit said, "Thank you for today, for taking care of me." "It is part of the job," he replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested it was more than that. "Is it?" Kit set down her spoon and looked at him directly. "Is that all this is to you? A job?" Jacob's hand stilled halfway to his mouth. Slowly, he set his spoon down and met her gaze. "What are you asking me, Kit?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his low voice made something flutter in her chest. "I am asking if I am the only one who has been feeling like there is something more happening here than just employer and employee." The silence stretched between them, taut as a rope pulled tight. Then Jacob pushed back from the table and stood, pacing to the window and back, his hand raking through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "You are my employer," he said finally. "You own this ranch. I work for you. There are lines that should not be crossed." "Lines you do not want to cross, or lines you think you should not cross," Kit pressed. "Because those are different things." He turned to face her, and the raw emotion in his expression took her breath away. "Do you know what it was like watching you fall? Seeing you hit the ground and lie there, not moving. For those few seconds before I reached you, I thought—" He cut himself off, his jaw clenched tight. "What did you think?" Kit asked softly. "I thought I might lose you before I ever had the chance to tell you how I feel." The words came out rough, almost angry. "But that does not change the facts. You are Kit Dawson, owner of the Double Creek Ranch. I am just the hired help. People will talk. They will say I am taking advantage, that I am trying to manipulate you into God knows what." Kit stood, moving carefully around the table until she stood directly in front of him. Do you think I care what people say? You should. Your reputation matters. So does my happiness. She reached up, her hand cupping his jaw, feeling the rasp of his evening stubble against her palm. I did not come all the way to Illinois to live according to other people's rules, Jacob. I came here to build the life I wanted. And what I want, what I have wanted for weeks now, if I am being honest, is you. His hands came up to grip her shoulders, not pushing her away but not pulling her closer either, holding her in place while he searched her face. Are you sure? Because once we cross this line there is no going back. Everything changes. I am sure, Kit whispered. Are you? His answer was to bend his head and kiss her, gentle at first and then deeper when she responded, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck, despite the protest from her bruised ribs. He tasted like coffee and wood smoke, and the feel of his hands spanning her waist, careful of her injuries but undeniably possessive, made her heart race. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. I am not sure this is wise. Probably not, Kit agreed. But I find I do not care. He laughed, the sound surprised and delighted, and kissed her again. The next weeks passed in a haze of healing and discovery. Kit recovered from her injuries under Jacob's watchful care, and they navigated the new territory of their relationship with the same careful attention they applied to ranch management. They kept their changed status quiet, not out of shame but out of a mutual desire to figure out what they meant to each other before subjecting themselves to outside opinions. But of course, in a town the size of Galesburg, secrets did not stay secret for long. The reckoning came on a Saturday in late November, when Kit rode to town for supplies and encountered a group of women outside the general store. She recognized several of them from the handful of church services she had attended, respectable matrons who ran the social life of Galesburg with iron fists in velvet gloves. Miss Dawson, one of them, a woman named Mrs. Harriet Pemberton, greeted her with a smile that did not reach her eyes. How lovely to see you. We were just discussing the upcoming Thanksgiving social. I do hope you will attend. I had not heard about it, Kit admitted, tying her horse to the rail. Oh, it is quite the event. All the good families in the county attend. Of course, we understand that your situation is rather unusual. Mrs. Pemberton's smile sharpened. Living alone on that ranch with only a single man for company, it must be quite challenging to maintain proper standards. Kit felt her spine stiffen. I am not sure I understand your meaning, Mrs. Pemberton. Oh, I am sure you do, dear. It is simply that people talk. A young, unmarried woman living in close quarters with a hired hand, no chaperone, no family supervision, it raises questions about propriety. The other women nodded in solemn agreement, their faces arranged in expressions of concern that barely masked their eagerness for scandal. Kit took a deep breath, reminding herself that causing a scene in the middle of town would not help matters. Mr. Zachariah lives in the bunkhouse. I live in the main house. We run a cattle ranch, Mrs. Pemberton, which requires a great deal of work and leaves very little time for impropriety, even if we were inclined toward it. Nevertheless, appearances matter. Perhaps you might consider hiring a housekeeper, someone to lend respectability to the arrangement. I know several women who would be suitable. What Mrs. Pemberton really meant, Kit understood, was that she wanted to install a spy in the Double Creek household, someone who could report back on Kit's activities and relationship with Jacob. The realization made her angry in a way she had not been angry in years. I appreciate your concern, she said with icy politeness, but I am quite capable of managing my own affairs. Now, if you will excuse me, I have shopping to complete. She brushed past them into the store, her hands shaking with suppressed fury. The proprietor, A kind man named Mr. Grayson took one look at her face and tactfully busied himself in the back room while Kit collected her supplies and regained her composure. The encounter rattled her more than she wanted to admit. She had known that her unconventional living situation would raise eyebrows, but she had underestimated the speed and venom with which the town's gossips would attack. By the time she returned to the ranch, the sun was setting, and her earlier anger had transformed into something closer to despair. Jacob took one look at her face when she pulled up to the barn and immediately came to help unload the supplies. What happened? Kit told him about the confrontation with Mrs. Pemberton and her friends, watching his expression darken as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, methodically stacking supplies in the barn with more force than necessary. "They are right," he said finally. "What?" "Not about the impropriety, but about the situation. We are giving them ammunition, Kit. An unmarried woman and a man living on the same property. Everyone knows we spend all our time together. Now that we are actually," he gestured vaguely between them, "now that we are courting, or whatever we are calling this, it is only going to get worse. So what are you suggesting? That we stop?" "No." He turned to face her, his expression intense. "I am suggesting we get married." Kit's heart lurched. "That is not a proposal. You are right, it is not." Jacob crossed the space between them and took both her hands in his. "Katherine Dawson, I know we have only been courting for a few weeks. I know this is fast and unconventional and probably ill-advised. But I also know that I want to wake up every morning knowing you are mine and I am yours. I want to build this ranch together, not as employer and employee, but as partners. I want the right to stand beside you when people like Mrs. Pemberton try to make you feel small. Will you marry me?" Kit's eyes stung with sudden tears. "People will say you are only marrying me for the ranch." "Let them say it. I know the truth. You know the truth. That is what matters." "And what is the truth?" he smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face into something that took her breath away. "The truth is that I fell in love with you the day you walked into that saloon and demanded what was yours. The truth is that I would work for you for no wages at all, just for the privilege of being near you. The truth is that I do not give a damn about the ranch except that it is yours and therefore precious. So yes, people will talk, but they were going to talk anyway. At least this way you will have a ring on your finger and a husband who adores you." "You love me," Kit whispered. "Desperately," he confirmed. "Did I not mention that?" She laughed through her tears and threw her arms around his neck, ignoring the twinge in her still healing ribs. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." He kissed her there in the barn, surrounded by feed sacks and horse tack, and Kit thought she had never been happier in her entire life. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Presbyterian church, attended by the few people in Galesburg who had welcomed Kit without judgment. Dr. Shaw served as her witness, and Pete and Samuel stood up for Jacob, both men grinning like fools and insisting on buying rounds at the saloon afterward in celebration. Mrs. Pemberton and her circle did not attend, and Kit found she did not care in the slightest. The winter that followed was the happiest of Kit's life. She and Jacob moved into the main house together, establishing routines and rhythms of married life. They worked side by side during the day, managing the ranch through the challenges of snow and cold and the general orneriness of livestock. Evenings were spent in front of the fire, Kit reading aloud from the agricultural journals and newspapers they subscribed to, while Jacob whittled or mended tack, their legs tangled together on the sofa in comfortable domesticity. They learned each other's bodies and hearts with the same thoroughness they applied to learning the land. Kit discovered that Jacob laughed in his sleep sometimes, that he sang off-key when he thought no one could hear, that he was ticklish along his ribs. Jacob learned that Kit was terrified of spiders but fearless with cattle, that she cried at sentimental songs but kept her composure in emergencies, that she liked to be held tightly when she woke from nightmares about losing him. Spring brought new life to the ranch. The cattle began calving in March, which meant round-the-clock vigilance to help with difficult births and protect newborns from predators. Kit and Jacob took turns on night watch, stumbling into the house at odd hours to grab a few hours of sleep before heading back out. It was exhausting work, but it was also deeply satisfying to see the herd growing, to know that their efforts were building something sustainable. It was during one of these late-night vigils, sitting together on hay bales in the barn while they waited for a first-time mother to deliver, that Kit brought up the subject that had been on her mind for weeks. "I want to expand," she said without preamble. "Buy the Peterson property to the east. It has been sitting empty since old Mr. Peterson died last fall, and I heard his children want to sell." Jacob considered this, his expression thoughtful in the lantern light. "It is good land. Would increase our grazing area by about 40%, but it is also a significant investment. We would need to take out a loan. I have been running the numbers. If we sell the steers at market prices similar to last year and keep our operating costs steady, we could pay off a loan in 5 years while still maintaining a comfortable reserve. You have really thought this through." "I have." Kit leaned against his shoulder, watching the laboring cow. "I want to build something big, Jacob, not just for us, but for our children someday. I want the Double Creek to be the finest ranch in the county." His arm came around her waist, pulling her closer. "Then we will make it happen. Together." The cow delivered a healthy bull calf 20 minutes later, and Kit and Jacob stumbled back to the house as dawn broke over the prairie, tired and dirty and utterly content. The Peterson property purchase went through in June, financed by a loan from the bank in town that made Kit's palms sweat when she signed the paperwork. But Jacob's confidence bolstered her own, and they threw themselves into improving the new land, repairing fences and clearing brush, and gradually integrating it into the Double Creek operation. They hired 2 permanent hands that summer, younger men who were willing to learn and work hard. With the additional help, Jacob was able to focus more on breeding and improving the quality of their herd, while Kit managed the business side and began cultivating relationships with buyers in Chicago and Kansas City. The ranch prospered in ways that went beyond financial success. Kit found herself becoming part of the community, earning respect through hard work and fair dealing. The gossips eventually found other targets, and even Mrs. Pemberton unbent enough to congratulate Kit when she ran into her at the dressmaker's shop in town. "I may have been premature in my judgments," the older woman admitted stiffly. "Mr. Zachariah is clearly a man of good character, and you have proven yourself a capable rancher. I apologize for my earlier concern." It was as close to an apology as Mrs. Pemberton was probably capable of giving, and Kit accepted it with grace. She had learned that holding grudges required too much energy that could be better spent elsewhere. The first real test of their marriage came in the fall of their second year together, when a neighboring rancher named Thomas Blackwell made an aggressive offer to buy the Double Creek. Blackwell ran the largest ranch in the county, and he had a reputation for sharp business practices that occasionally crossed the line into outright ruthlessness. "Name your price," he told Kit when he rode up to the house one afternoon, not bothering to dismount. "I will pay double what the property is worth. You and your husband can retire comfortably, maybe buy a nice house in town." "The ranch is not for sale," Kit replied firmly. "Everything is for sale at the right price, Mrs. Zachariah. You are young, you do not understand how difficult ranching can be. Drought, disease, market crashes, any of those things could wipe you out in a season. Take the money while it is on the table. I said, no, Mr. Blackwell. The Double Creek is our home. We are not interested in selling. His expression hardened. You will regret this decision. Mark my words. Kit watched him ride away with a sense of foreboding that only intensified when Jacob returned from town later that day with troubling news. Blackwell had been spreading rumors that the Double Creek cattle were diseased, trying to undermine their reputation with potential buyers. It is not true, Jacob said, pacing the kitchen with barely contained fury. Our herd is healthy. I would stake my reputation on it. But if the rumors gain traction, we could lose contracts. Then we fight back, Kit declared. We invite buyers to the ranch, let them inspect the herd themselves. We document the health of every animal. And we make it clear that Blackwell is spreading lies because he is angry we would not sell to him. It was a battle that lasted weeks, involving letters to livestock associations, testimonials from Dr. Shaw and other veterinarians in the region, and strategic meetings with buyers who had previously worked with them. The stress took its toll, manifesting in sleepless nights and short tempers and worry that sat like a stone in Kit's stomach. But through it all, she and Jacob presented a united front. When Kit doubted herself, certain they would lose everything, Jacob reminded her of how far they had come. When Jacob wanted to confront Blackwell directly, possibly violently, Kit talked him down and focused his energy on solutions instead of revenge. In the end, their reputation survived intact, and Blackwell's campaign of rumors fizzled out when several other ranchers publicly defended the Double Creek's integrity. The incident left Kit shaken but also stronger, more confident in her ability to protect what they had built. We make a good team, Jacob told her one night as they lay in bed, the crisis finally behind them. We do, Kit agreed, her head pillowed on his chest. I could not imagine doing this with anyone else. Good, because you are stuck with me. She smiled into the darkness. I can think of worse fates. The years passed in a blur of seasons and work and gradual growth. The Double Creek expanded again when the Johnson family sold their adjoining property and retired to St. Louis to be near their grandchildren. Kit and Jacob hired more hands, built a second barn, and began experimenting with new breeding techniques that improved the quality of their beef. Kit turned 25, then 26, and began to wonder when children might enter the picture. It was not something she and Jacob discussed directly, but the subject hung between them, particularly when they visited neighbors with young families or attended church and saw the Sunday school children racing across the lawn. She was hanging laundry on a bright May morning in their 4th year of marriage when the queasiness hit her, sudden and overwhelming. Kit barely made it to the side of the house before she was sick, retching into the flower bed she had planted the previous spring. When the nausea passed, she sat back on her heels, mind racing through possibilities. Dr. Shaw confirmed it 3 days later with an examination and a knowing smile. Congratulations, Kit. You are about 10 weeks along, I would estimate. The baby should come around December. Kit walked out of the doctor's office in a daze, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach. A baby. She and Jacob were going to have a baby. The thought filled her with equal parts joy and terror. How did one run a ranch and raise a child? How would they manage? What if something went wrong? She rode home slowly, rehearsing different ways to tell Jacob the news. But when she reached the ranch and found him in the barn, treating a horse with a stone bruise, all her planned speeches evaporated. I am pregnant, she blurted out. Jacob's head whipped up so fast she worried he might injure himself. The jar of ointment in his hand clattered to the floor, forgotten. What? I am pregnant. Dr. Shaw confirmed it. The baby will come in December." For a moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face split into the widest grin she had ever seen, and he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, sweeping her up in a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "We are having a baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Kit, we are having a baby." "I know." "Are you happy?" He set her down carefully, his hands framing her face. "Happy? I am terrified and thrilled and so much in love with you I can barely breathe. Is that normal?" "I have no idea," Kit admitted, "but I feel exactly the same way." The pregnancy progressed without major complications. Though Kit's first trimester was marked by nausea that struck at unpredictable times and exhaustion that left her struggling to stay awake past sunset. Jacob fussed over her constantly, much to her alternating amusement and irritation, insisting she rest more and work less despite her protests that she was pregnant, not incapacitated. By her second trimester, the nausea faded and Kit felt better than she had in months, full of energy and determination to prepare for the baby's arrival. They converted the smallest upstairs bedroom into a nursery, painting the walls a cheerful yellow, and building a cradle from oak wood that Jacob sanded and polished until it was smooth as glass. The ranch hands, once they learned of Kit's condition, became absurdly protective. Samuel, who had daughters of his own, appointed himself her unofficial guardian, appearing at her elbow anytime she attempted to lift anything heavier than a coffee cup. Pete took to cooking enormous meals, convinced that Kit was not eating enough for 2 despite all evidence to the contrary. "I appreciate the concern," Kit told them during one particularly ridiculous incident involving 3 grown men arguing over who would carry a small basket of eggs into the house. "But I promise you, I am perfectly capable of functioning. Women have been having babies and running ranches for generations." "Not on my watch, they have not," Samuel declared. "You are the boss, Mrs. Zachariah, but that baby is everyone's responsibility. We all have a stake in making sure the future generation of Double Creek ownership arrives safely." Kit tried to argue, caught Jacob's amused expression, and gave up. If the men wanted to fuss over her, she supposed there were worse problems to have. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow in November and temperatures that plunged well below freezing. Kit grew larger and more uncomfortable, her back aching constantly, and her sleep disrupted by the baby's increasingly vigorous kicks. Dr. Shaw visited the ranch weekly as her due date approached, checking on both Kit and baby and preparing Jacob for what to expect during the birth. "I will be fine," Kit assured him after one particularly thorough examination. "Dr. Shaw says everything is progressing normally." "Define normal," Jacob said, pacing the parlor like a caged animal. "Because from where I stand, you look exhausted and uncomfortable, and I am completely useless to help." "You are not useless. You are taking care of everything else so I can focus on this." She patted her enormous belly with rueful affection. "Besides, women have been doing this since the beginning of time. My body knows what to do." But when her labor started 3 weeks before her due date on a bitterly cold December night, Kit found herself wishing for some of Jacob's certainty. The contractions began as a dull ache in her back, easy to dismiss as just another pregnancy discomfort. But they intensified quickly, coming closer together and with increasing ferocity. Jacob sent Pete racing to town to fetch Dr. Shaw while he helped Kit upstairs to their bedroom, his face pale but his hand steady. "You are all right. You can do this. I am right here." The labor lasted 13 hours, the longest 13 hours of Kit's life. She drifted through waves of pain that seemed to go on forever, anchored only by Jacob's presence at her side. He held her hand, wiped her face with cool cloths, murmured encouragement when she was convinced she could not continue. Doctor. Shaw moved between the foot of the bed and her medical bag with brisk efficiency, monitoring the baby's progress and offering instructions. And then, finally, at dawn on December 17th in the year 1885, their son came into the world with a lusty cry that made both Kit and Jacob dissolve into tears of relief and joy. "A boy," Dr. Shaw announced, wrapping the baby in soft blankets and placing him in Kit's arms. "A healthy, perfect boy." Kit looked down at the tiny face, the button nose and the shock of dark hair so like Jacob's, and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "Hello, little one. We have been waiting for you." Jacob knelt beside the bed, one arm around Kit, the other hand gently touching their son's head with a reverence usually reserved for sacred things. "He is perfect. You are perfect. I love you both so much." They named him James Thomas Zachariah after Jacob's father and Kit's. Young Jamie, as he quickly became known, turned out to have his mother's green eyes and his father's stubbornness, along with a set of lungs that could be heard across the ranch when he was displeased. The next months passed in a blur of sleepless nights, countless diaper changes, and the peculiar mix of exhaustion and elation that characterized new parenthood. Kit learned to nurse while reviewing account books, to soothe a crying baby with one hand while writing correspondence with the other. Jacob discovered a previously unknown talent for singing lullabies, his deep voice calming Jamie when nothing else would work. The ranch hands treated Jamie like a precious communal resource, taking turns holding him and entertaining him with ridiculous faces and nonsensical songs. Even Samuel, who had claimed to be too old and tired for baby duty, could often be found in the barn showing Jamie the horses and explaining ranch management to an infant who could not possibly understand a word. "He needs to learn these things early," Samuel insisted when Kit pointed out that Jamie was only 6 months old. "Of course," Kit agreed solemnly. "Cannot start teaching cattle management too soon." The business of ranching continued around the demands of parenthood. Kit had hired a local girl named Mary to help with household chores and baby care, which allowed her to return to managing the ranch's finances and operations. It was a careful balancing act, and some days Kit felt like she was failing at everything simultaneously. But then she would look at her thriving son, her prospering ranch, her husband who loved her completely, and realize that failure was not measured in occasional burnt dinners or financial ledgers that did not balance the first time through. Jamie took his first steps on a sunny June day, staggering across the kitchen floor into his father's waiting arms. Kit watched from the doorway, her heart so full she thought it might burst, and realized that all of this was worth every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt. The years flowed past like the creek that gave the ranch its name, steady and life-giving. Jamie grew from infant to toddler to a small boy who followed his father everywhere, mimicking Jacob's walk and his serious expressions. He learned to ride almost before he could properly walk, sitting in front of Jacob on the big bay gelding and shrieking with delight as they cantered across the pastures. When Jamie was 3, Kit became pregnant again. This time, the experience was easier because she knew what to expect, and also harder because she was chasing an energetic toddler while her body went through the changes of pregnancy. Their daughter arrived on a stormy March evening in 1889, smaller and quieter than her brother but no less perfect. They named her Rose Ellen, after Jacob's mother and Dr. Shaw, who had safely delivered both their children. Rose had Kit's red hair and Jacob's blue-gray eyes, along with a temperament that could shift from sunny to stormy in seconds. "She is going to keep us on our toes," Dr. Shaw predicted, examining the infant with professional thoroughness. "This one has opinions." She was right. Rose grew into a fierce, independent child who wanted to do everything herself and protested loudly when adults tried to help. She adored her older brother and followed him everywhere, much to Jamie's mixed pleasure and irritation. Together, the two children brought chaos and joy to the Double Creek in equal measure. The ranch prospered as the children grew. Kit and Jacob had paid off all their loans by 1890 and owned the property free and clear, a milestone they celebrated with a rare day off and a family picnic by the creek. The Double Creek had a reputation as one of the finest ranches in Illinois, known for quality cattle and honest business practices. They had built something together that went beyond land and livestock. They had built a life, a family, a legacy that would continue after them. It was on Jamie's 10th birthday, during a party attended by half the children in the county and most of their parents, that Mrs. Pemberton approached Kit with an observation that made her smile. "I was wrong about you," the older woman said without preamble. "When you first arrived in Galesburg, I thought you were just a foolish girl playing at ranching, but you have proven yourself to be a capable businesswoman and a credit to the community. Your husband is a lucky man." "I think we are both lucky," Kit replied diplomatically. "Yes, well, Mrs. Pemberton looked around at the thriving ranch, the happy children running across the yard, the home that radiated warmth and prosperity. "I suppose you have earned the right to be smug about it. Good day, Mrs. Zachariah." Kit watched her leave, then caught Jacob's eye across the yard. He was teaching a group of children how to rope a practice dummy, his patience evident in every gesture. Rose sat on his shoulders, her small hands tangled in his hair, giggling at everything. Jamie stood beside his father, holding a rope and looking completely serious as he mimicked Jacob's instructions to the younger children. This was her life. This was what she had won all those years ago when she walked into a saloon and demanded what was hers. Not just a ranch, though the Double Creek was certainly valuable. She had won a partner, a family, a future beyond anything she could have imagined. Jacob looked up, saw her watching, and smiled. The same smile he had given her when he proposed in the barn when Jamie was born, when Rose took her first steps. A smile that said she was his home, his heart, his everything. Kit smiled back, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their third child grew, and thought about how a single moment of courage could change everything. How claiming what was hers had led to claiming so much more. A life rich with love and purpose, and the deep satisfaction of building something that would last. The sun set over the Double Creek Ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and Kit stood surrounded by her family and friends, grateful for every choice that had brought her to this moment. The journey from that saloon in Galesburg to this celebration had been filled with challenges and triumphs, heartache and joy. But she would not change a single moment of it. This was her happily ever after, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Not because it was easy, but because it was worth fighting for. Not because she had found it waiting for her, but because she had built it with her own two hands and the man who stood beside her through everything. And that, Kit thought as Jamie called for her to come see something and Rose demanded to be swung around, and Jacob caught her hand as she passed, giving it a gentle squeeze that communicated volumes without words. That was more than enough. The Double Creek Ranch continued to thrive through the changing seasons and years. Their third child, a boy they named Thomas Jacob after both his grandfathers, arrived in January of 1891 during a snowstorm that buried the ranch under 3 feet of white. He was a peaceful baby, content to observe the world with solemn dark eyes that seemed to see everything. As the children grew, Kit and Jacob made sure each of them understood the value of hard work and the responsibility that came with owning land. Jamie, as the eldest, took naturally to ranching, spending every spare moment with his father learning the intricacies of cattle management and land stewardship. Rose showed more interest in the business side, sitting with Kit to learn bookkeeping and contract negotiation, her sharp mind quickly grasping concepts that had taken Kit years to master. Thomas, when he was old enough, proved to have a gift with horses, able to gentle even the most skittish animals with patience and intuition. The turn of the century brought changes to Galesburg and the surrounding area. The railroad expanded, bringing new opportunities for shipping cattle to market. Automobiles began appearing on the streets, strange mechanical creatures that spooked the horses and delighted the children. Electricity came to town, though it would be several more years before lines reached out to the rural ranches. Through it all, the Double Creek remained a constant, a testament to what could be built through hard work, smart management, and the kind of partnership that made both people stronger. Kit and Jacob weathered droughts and harsh winters, market fluctuations and equipment failures, the normal trials of ranch life. But they weathered them together, their bond deepening with each passing year. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Jacob surprised Kit with a gift that made her cry. It was a new sign for the ranch, carved from oak and beautifully painted, that read Double Creek Ranch, established 1882. Jacob and Katherine Zachariah, proprietors. "We built this together," he said as they stood hand in hand looking at the sign he had just mounted at the ranch entrance. "Your name should be on it too." Kit leaned against his shoulder, her hair now streaked with the first threads of silver, her hands bearing the marks of 2 decades of ranch work. "I never expected this," she said softly. "When I rode into Galesburg all those years ago, I thought I was just coming to claim some property. I never imagined I would find a home, a family, a life so full of love." "Best arm wrestling match I ever lost," Jacob replied, which had become something of a private joke between them over the years, though the truth was more complex and beautiful than that simple statement suggested. The real story, the one they told their children and grandchildren in the years to come, was about courage and second chances, about a woman who demanded respect in a world that wanted to dismiss her, and a man who was wise enough to see her worth. About building something together that was greater than the sum of its parts. As the sun set on their 20th anniversary, painting the Illinois prairie in shades of amber and rose, Kit and Jacob walked back to the house hand in hand, their children's laughter drifting from the barn where they were finishing evening chores. The ranch stretched around them, every fence line, every building, every head of cattle a testament to their shared vision and combined effort. This was the life Kit had fought for, the future she had built with her own determination, and with the love of a good man who had seen her not as an obstacle but as a partner. And if sometimes she thought back to that younger version of herself, striding into Maginty's saloon with more courage than sense, demanding what was rightfully hers, she smiled at how that girl could never have imagined the richness of the life that awaited her. The Double Creek Ranch would continue long after them, passed down through their children and their children's children. But the real legacy was not in the land or the cattle, or even the family name. It was in the example they set of what could be achieved when two people chose to build something together, facing challenges as partners and celebrating triumphs as equals. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were settled, and Kit and Jacob sat together on the porch watching the stars come out over the prairie, they knew they had found something rare and precious. Not just love, though they had that in abundance, but true partnership. The kind of bond that made them both better, stronger, more capable than they could ever have been alone. That was the real story of the Double Creek Ranch. Not how Kit won it in an arm wrestling match, though that made for a good tale, but how she and Jacob built it together into something that would last for generations. How they created not just a successful business, but a home filled with love and laughter, hard work and hope, the kind of life worth fighting for and worth celebrating every single day. And as the years continued to pass, as their children grew and married and had children of their own, as the ranch continued to prosper under their careful stewardship, Kit and Jacob never forgot how it all began. With courage, with determination, with a willingness to take a chance on something uncertain, with love that grew from respect and partnership into something deeper and more enduring than either of them could have predicted. They grew old together, their hair turning silver, their bodies bearing the marks of a lifetime of hard work. But their love never diminished, never faded into comfortable companionship or familiar routine. It remained vital and alive, a constant source of strength and joy. When Jamie took over primary management of the ranch in his 30s, with his siblings as equal partners, Kit and Jacob finally allowed themselves to step back, to enjoy their grandchildren and the fruit of their decades of labor. They traveled a bit, visiting places they had only read about. They attended community events and church socials, no longer the controversial young couple but respected elders whose opinion was sought on matters large and small. But mostly, they stayed at the Double Creek because it was home in a way that went beyond simple geography. It was the place where they had built their life together, where every building and fence line held memories, where the land itself seemed to recognize their footsteps. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the entire town of Galesburg turned out for the celebration. The ranch was filled with friends and family, with former ranch hands who had moved on to their own properties but never forgot where they learned the trade, with neighbors who had become friends over decades of mutual support. Mayor Thompson, who had been a young boy when Kit first arrived in Galesburg, gave a speech praising the Zachariahs for their contributions to the community and their example of successful partnership. Kit sat beside Jacob, his hand firm in hers, and listened with a full heart as people they had known for half a century spoke of their respect and affection. When it was Kit's turn to speak, she kept it simple. 50 years ago, I walked into Maginty's saloon looking for a ranch hand who I thought was standing between me and my inheritance. Instead, I found my future. Jacob could have fought me, could have contested the will or made my life difficult. Instead, he offered to help, to teach me, to work beside me. That decision changed both our lives, and I am grateful for it every single day. She looked at Jacob, seeing not the old man with silver hair and weathered face, but the younger version who had stood in that saloon and chosen grace over bitterness, partnership over pride. Thank you for seeing me, for valuing me, for building this life with me. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Jacob stood and pulled her into his arms for a kiss that made their grandchildren cheer and their great-grandchildren giggle. I love you, Kit Zachariah, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. I loved you when you walked into that saloon. I loved you when you agreed to marry me. I love you now, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond. It was not poetry, not the kind of flowery declaration found in romantic novels. But it was true, and that made it more valuable than any pretty words could be. They lived 8 more years together, years filled with quiet joy and the satisfaction of watching their legacy continue. They saw Jamie's children grow and start families of their own. They watched Rose become one of the most respected businesswomen in Illinois, expanding the Double Creek's operations to include partnerships with ranches across 3 states. They celebrated when Thomas opened his own breeding stable, applying his gift with horses to create a thriving enterprise. Jacob passed first, peacefully in his sleep on a cold January night in 1903. Kit woke to find him beside her, a slight smile on his face, gone somewhere she could not follow. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that seemed to hollow her out from the inside. But she endured it the same way she had endured every other challenge in her life, by putting one foot in front of the other, and doing what needed to be done. She lived another 2 years, long enough to see the ranch she and Jacob had built flourish under her children's management, long enough to hold her newest great-grandchild and see her own red hair and green eyes reflected in the baby's face. Long enough to be certain that the legacy they had created would continue. Kit passed away in the spring of 1905. Sitting on the porch of the Double Creek Ranch looking out over the land she had claimed as a young woman and made her own through decades of hard work and love. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her, and her last words were of Jacob, of how she could feel him waiting for her, of how it was time to go home. They buried her beside him on a hill overlooking the creek, under a spreading oak tree they had planted together 40 years earlier. The headstone was simple, bearing both their names and the dates of their births and deaths, along with a single line that summed up their lives together. Partners in all things forever. The Double Creek Ranch continued through the generations, each new owner adding their own contributions while honoring the foundation that Kit and Jacob had built. The story of how it all began, of the woman who won the ranch deed and the cowboy who lost, but offered to stay on as hired help, became part of family legend, told and retold with varying degrees of embellishment and accuracy. But the core truth remained constant through all the retellings. That once, in a time when women were expected to be quiet and deferential and content with what men decided they should have, one woman refused to accept those limitations. And once, when a man could have been bitter about losing what he had worked for, he chose instead to be gracious and helpful and open to possibility. And from those 2 choices, made independently but leading inevitably to each other, came a love story that lasted a lifetime and a legacy that lasted far longer. Came a ranch that prospered through good times and bad, a family that grew strong and close, a partnership that showed everyone who witnessed it what could be achieved when 2 people chose to build something together rather than tearing each other down. That was the real story of Katherine and Jacob Zachariah. Not a fairy tale with a simple beginning and end, but a real, complex, beautiful life built one day at a time through love and work, and an unwavering commitment to each other, and to the land they called home. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything.